Welcome to episode 14 of Storm the Norm, the fortnightly podcast where we pick up norms that come in the way of businesses succeeding in a disruptive world. I'm Narayan.
And I'm Anisha Motwani.
Anisha, I'm jumping ahead a bit, but today's episode is, in a way, a continuation of a thread we explored with Mohit Malhotra, the CEO of Dabur, in our last episode.
Why do you say that?
Well, in the last episode, we spoke about what keeps Indian brands from succeeding globally. In today's episode, the norm we want to storm is on the Indian startup ecosystem. Specifically, Indian startups are at best clones of their global counterparts, and perhaps that could very well be their biggest obstacle in realizing their potential.
So what you're saying is Indian startups are not in the same league and they're at best copycats.
I guess so.
When you put it like that, I think you can't miss the similarities with the previous episode. Though we were not talking about brands not being copycats there, we were talking about why they can't succeed globally. And here we are talking about why Indian startups are not able to succeed in their own market and make it then globally as well, make it big globally as well. So there is a subtle difference between the two. But you're right, absolutely, because when you look at multiple categories, fintech, e-commerce, travel, hospitality, mobility, they all seem like clones of existing Western models.
Let me push this question a little further about what are the obstacles in their path, right? And I'm going to break it down because it's going to be a mouthful into 2 or 3 different questions. You know what further this obscures? First, it obscures the possibilities of exploring the immense possibilities that a market like India, as large and as diverse as India, offers. But obviously, you need original ideas to be brought to fruition with scale for
True.
that. The second, it obscures the fact that the pockets of talent, tech, and infrastructure we have in India where startups can succeed, that's very limited right now.
Bangalore and Gurgaon.
Exactly. And the third piece is because of these two, it obscures the fact that venture capitalists might balk at putting the bets on India despite the huge market potential.
Sure. It makes me think, for all that India has been one of the foundational civilizations in the world and contributed such great original thoughts and ideas that still underpin much of how we live, why haven't we been able to lead from the front on this one?
I don't want to lose sight of the fact that external factors such as government policies, the socio-political climate, cultural differences, these can all play a role, I know that. But without unique and scalable models, indeed, how can the Indian startup ecosystem even think of becoming a viable alternative to Western ones? Thankfully, we don't have to answer all of those questions ourselves because we have as our guest expert today one of the most eminently qualified people to storm the norm. Please welcome Mr. G.V. Ravi Shankar, who is a Managing Director of Sequoia Capital India.
I would first like to welcome you on board. Thank you for joining us.
Hey Anisha, Narayan, thank you so much for having me on this podcast. I've enjoyed your previous ones and hopefully this is a good one too. And you guys have picked up a very interesting topic, I should say. And, I'd love to add my perspective to this. Why don't we get started?
We all know that most Indian startups are prone to actually emulate successful global ideas, by and large just fine-tuning existing business models to serve the local needs. So we know that there's an Ola for Uber and there's a Gaana for Spotify. There is an Oyo Rooms that followed Airbnb, and Flipkart, of course, followed Amazon. So while India has provided a nurturing ground to numerous startups, and we've seen that across business models and categories now, but what we normally notice is that these are variations of the global counterparts. What's your perspective, Chi?
Kind of markets, businesses, and more general human beings and their needs. It tends to be somewhat similar across geographies, but it tends to lag, and many times it may rhyme with something in another geography. And the reason it may lag is because, as you're all well aware, some markets are relatively more developed markets and richer markets where consumers have gotten to these needs and kind of started enjoying some of the benefits earlier than markets which may be developing like India. And there is always a certain level of ecosystem maturity that may be required and a purchasing power that may be required for some of this to come to life. So in many ways, the examples that we picked up, let's say Ola for Uber, or Flipkart for Amazon, are following global norms, but it's also because there is a time when these types of models are more applicable to India. The need is the same, and if the solution that has worked in other markets is a good solution, and is probably the more efficient solution to address a particular need, chances are that Indian founders, if they come across it, may believe that similar thing will work for India. And which is why sometimes, while with a lag, we start something here. And many times it looks like the same, but as we peel the onion, you would also realize there are many things that we have to do for India are quite different from what may have worked in the global markets. And a similar example in Flipkart and Amazon would be, Flipkart was the first probably globally to introduce cash on delivery, right? Which is again a very uniquely Indian need, because people in India did not use credit cards that widely, and and there was a trust factor which we had to overcome. So cash on delivery allowed for people to kind of order, get it, and then pay for it, so they feel safe about it, right? So, but both of them are satisfying a need, whether it's Ola or it's Flipkart, are satisfying a need which is global, which is either making taxis available easily from a transportation perspective, or making retail available easily, especially when India does not have that much organized retail relative to the West. It was a far greater value prop for the Indian audience than the West. But that's the overall point, right? Which is the needs are not that dissimilar, but the way the need is addressed may be slightly different, and then companies adapt for it. So we call some of these things mutations, right? In some ways, it's like the world of biology. You have to mutate to satisfy the need of this particular environment, and companies do that quite successfully, which is why I think these companies have given a tough fight to their global counterparts and continue to do so, right? So that's the first part. The part where I disagree a little bit is I do think these kind of end up becoming highlighted as the biggest successes, because some of these are globally the biggest success businesses. For example, Amazon is worth now, I don't know, 1 point something trillion dollars, 1.6, 1.7, I haven't tracked recently. Uber at IPO was worth 60, 70 billion, something in that range, and I don't know what it's trading at right now. But these are big successes, known globally. And so when the counterparts in India are kind of coming up, then it becomes easy to identify them, saying, hey, these are kind of copycats, or these are inspired by the West. And they are, but the things that get less attention are India-specific innovations that we see, which again, because there isn't a global counterpart, maybe takes time for them to become the ones that they become and get the attention they deserve. Right? I'll pick up two examples. These are companies that I'm personally involved in, and with the caveat, these are Sequoia companies. So I'm obviously biased favorably towards them. But let's take a company like Byju, right? Then we invested in Byju in 2015. EdTech was an early, if at all, there was no trend, but it was an early kind of thing that was picking up. And we believed that technology will have a significant impact on education. But if you look at the West, there are no examples of companies like Byju that even today exist, right? Let alone in 2015. So there was no, Byju type model, which is digital content-driven education, which were mostly asynchronous content that people can learn on their own pace. It existed in higher education in the form of MOOCs, but then there was nothing in K through 12, and obviously these were not, at that point it was not clear whether these things work, because also, and we'll come to this point later if you guys are interested, there's also a role VCs have to play in some of this, but I'll touch upon that later if we want to. But the point being, when we did something like Byju, there was no global counterpart. There were companies in China, but they were much more taking offline tutoring online, which was very different from how Byju was approaching this problem. So today, as a company that's kind of more recently raised money at $10 billion, it's become a company that is noted for having been the first of its type anywhere in the globe. And that model has gotten accepted. And thanks to COVID, EdTech has gotten even more attention, and that and this company finds itself as the global one of the large global companies and a trendsetter of some sort in that space, right? So that's an example of where somebody has innovated for India, and there is a good reason why it's happened in India, or may have happened in somewhere in Asia, but certainly happened in India, because the emphasis on education in India from parents is substantial, and people are willing to pay somewhat even out of the zone of what they think is affordability to get access to good education for their children, because that's our parents made sure education is kind of given to us in a way that will help us break out of the pack and be successful in life, right? So I think there is a significant focus on education, and that is why a company like Byju can actually, not just have the valuation, but also have real revenue scale in India and profits. So that's one example. The other example I'll pick up, where again something has happened in India, is a business called Rebel Foods, which is a multi-brand cloud kitchen company. Now, very interesting again that this is the company that finds itself as the largest of its types anywhere in the globe, and the market is now recognizing cloud kitchen as a phenomena. And you are starting to see more investments, not just in the developing markets, but also in the developed markets, because they're figuring out, much like e-commerce is a more efficient model than offline retail, cloud kitchen model may be a more creative and efficient model compared to having offline restaurants. And again, thanks to COVID, where you're starting to see people are not able to go to restaurants, cloud kitchens are there for the rescue. And companies like Rebel have thrived by launching the brands on some of these platforms and also on their own platforms. So again, this is an example where we can call it leapfrogging, because India's maybe the largest restaurant business, which is Domino's, is still a relatively small business compared to what we see globally. And so some of this has not really happened elsewhere. And when we come later, we come with more the latest opportunities that technology would allow you. So in that sense, that's another example of India first model, which we think will be a global model over time. Already Rebel is present in the Middle East. They launched in Indonesia, and they have just a pilot going on in UK. And so we do believe that some of these can be global businesses. So is Baiju. Baiju's launching in the North American market soon, and is already in the Middle East market. And over time, he'll be in Southeast Asian and other markets, because these models we think that work in India can sometimes work in other markets as well.
It sounds to me like what you're saying is maybe we need to change the yardsticks of comparison itself. Maybe we should stop figuring out if we are on par with global ecosystems as far as startups are concerned, for one. Even if that was the case, my second part of my question is, are we seeing the same number of big successes, unique successes, scaled successes that we are seeing around the world? And if not, then what's preventing us, or what can take us there?
Yeah, no, again, good question. What's the yardstick to measure success in some of this? I remember asking this to Darshan Bhai, who is the founder of Vinny Cosmetics,
Right.
and saying, hey, when does he think a brand or a product he launches is successful? And he said, look, it needs to sell at least 1 crore units, right? I mean, that's in this business the measure of success. And so, every business will have a way of saying, have you made a dent, right? So, let's say take the case of Baiju. He has about 3 million students, paying customers that he has, and maybe 50 plus million people that have experienced the product in some form through the mobile app that he launched. So now those are getting to some level of numbers, but still 3 million is probably a little over 1% of the population of school-going children. So we're really scratching the surface of what's possible when it comes to digital education in India, right? So maybe something is successful if we feel like we really started turning the tide for something to be a habitual product of some sort. Like if that becomes default, that's every company's dream. Can I be default in somebody's life? And that will be success. But that's kind of a very high bar. Very few things are really becoming default in people's lives. But that could be one measure of success, right? Like, am I moving the needle for enough of my customers that need a solution like this? And some businesses are network effects. So once you get to the tipping point, then more people adopt that, and it naturally allows for scale. Like some things are just second nature. Today, for example, if I'm ordering on Amazon, I don't think of anything else, and it becomes kind of your habit and the way you shop, right? So I do think these things happen over time, and that's the high bar for measuring success. Now, the other way to measure success is to say how much market cap has been created, and there it is a little bit of an unfair comparison to the West. Only because, again, the GDP that we have and the GDP they have is just kind of a fraction of some other countries' GDP. The size of businesses you will produce will also be somewhat of a fraction of what they have. So if they have a 10 billion hit and we have a 1.5, 2 billion hit, we're still doing really well, right? In that sense, we need to kind of calibrate for the size of our markets. But that does not mean we can't aspire to have global winners and globally successful companies, and someday $1 trillion market cap company coming out of India, because increasingly what technology is doing, it's really flattening the world in a way that you could actually be sitting in India and create a business that works anywhere in the world, right? And so if some of these businesses, whether it's a Baiju or a Rebel, start succeeding in other markets, then you will have the multinational version of the startup where Indian companies can actually go and create something globally relevant. And why can't the next big company? Sometimes it is about knowing what the horizon really is. You need to know what is the world out there, what is possible. Somebody has to set the bar high for you to also dream along. I mean, I'm not the maverick who'd have, been the guy who says, look, I've been told this, but I will be something different. There are such people, and, the Elon Musks of the world, we need many of them. But, there are people who need to be shown saying what is possible, right? And once you know something is possible, you'll do it. And this goes back to saying, when people ran the first under 4-minute mile, till then, for many, many years, it wasn't considered possible. Then after it was done, many, many more people did it. So, did we just get stronger? No, I mean, it's just something when it's known is possible, more people will do it. And similarly, if we start seeing these global MNCs out of India that are this $500 billion market cap someday, I'm guaranteeing you there'll be many more that will follow, right? So this is an ecosystem thing. This is where people help each other out. There is a level of breaking those, boundaries and going beyond. And when other people do it, you will start doing it. And, this is starting to happen, for example, in SaaS companies which are going global. We have examples of Zoho and Freshdesk that have done it. Now that they have done it, there are a dozen companies or more that are all kind of becoming global SaaS companies out of India, and they know it's possible, and they know you can deliver that, and you can build that scale of business. So they're following suit. So we need some of these people to be successful. We need the success to be visible and celebrated, and then more people will follow suit. I think it's a matter of time. We are super optimistic. We don't believe there is any reason why Indian startups can't be global. We just need to find a few successes.
So, GV, let me pick it up and come to a completely contrarian question linked to this. For every one that succeeds, there are 99 that fail. What explains this? Why is it that many, many Indians are not able to take their dreams to success?
My sense is, look, entrepreneurship is tough. The people that truly succeed in a way that it shows up in the newspapers and we all read about them, that's a very, very small proportion, right? And I'm not necessarily sure we are winning less compared to other markets, right? For what we say that there's a number of startups in India, but there are also so many more startups in the West or in China. Most markets are quite competitive. So today ideas...
Even if this was not a comparative analysis that we're looking at, by itself,
Sure.
How can India
there are a few points I want to...
success rates?
I want to touch upon a few points. So first, I do think being very successful in entrepreneurship is a low probability event. Like, we should just expect that to be low probability. And that's the reason why, if you look at investors also, when we pick companies, and we should expect the funded companies have a higher probability of success, right? But even within that, a few companies matter and most other things do not matter, right? And the reason I say do not matter is not that they've not become something, but they've not become something large enough for it to really move the needle for anyone, right? So even in businesses like ours, if we make 100 investments, there's a small proportion of them that really succeed and deliver most of the gains. This is called the power law. In kind of our business, it's called the power law, which is to say typically 10% of our investments deliver 90% of all the gains. It's even more skewed than the 80-20 principle, the Pareto principle that we know. Some of this is, again, we made so many mistakes as investors that we think of it as, look, there are always so many ways to get something wrong, right? Sometimes the founder market fit is not right. When I say founder market fit, different from product market fit, which is also another reason why you may not succeed. You have to have the right type of founder meeting the right kind of market opportunity. So that's one area where things can fail. Then there's the product market fit. The solution that you come up with, the product that you come out with, does not find purchase in the market, or does not find purchase at the price points that it makes, this a viable business. And going back to hence, you're buying customers, etc. Typically, this is what happens when you try to push the market faster than its natural rate of adoption, right? So if you take, again, an example of the taxi business in India, right? The reason you had to discount that is because if you have to, get a large number of people to adopt taxis, but if you're, I don't know the exact numbers, let's say the break even to make the taxi business work, break even is 20 rupees a kilometer, right? When the transportation, costs in India, if you take an auto is 7 or 10 rupees or 11 rupees a kilometer, if you have to sell a product at 20 rupees a kilometer, that really, stifles the size, the set of people that you can't really go behind the whole market. So then what you end up doing to show the traction is you say, okay, let me get them habituated to this comfort, and let's do this at 10 rupees a kilometer, which, by the way, Uber and Ola were doing for a long period of time, very aggressive pricing and discounted, right? That gives you a large market because more people now say, hey, this is more convenient and just a little bit more expensive, or maybe equal to auto, why don't I take it, right? Now, that is trying to push the market to adopt your solution before the market is fully there in terms of the price at which the market will absorb at scale, right? So sometimes the failures we see are inability to keep this kind of a unnatural push towards adoption going for a long period of time unless you have lots of capital. So if you run out of capital, which is the third reason people fail, you didn't have the capital to support your idea because you were either too early or your product market fit was not appropriate, and so companies stop funding.
So, GV, I think, again, you've covered so many points. I'm still trying to wrap my head around those. But maybe we can wrap this up asking for your take on 3 questions.
Sure.
One is, what is the one yardstick I should use to check if I would succeed or not? The second is, what is the thing that I should absolutely not do if I was to sustainable success? And the third is possibly, what is the one thing I should definitely do?
I almost feel like I have a single answer for all 3. If you think about people that have succeeded, every time when a success is spoken about, it feels like overnight success because it makes for a good narrative, right? But probably the single biggest thing that people should think about when they enter this is, do you have the grit to go through what it takes to be successful? Because this is not likely to be a linear journey. It is not a smooth curve. It is not an exponential curve, the way we think of entrepreneurship, because we are ending up mostly talking about and studying the successful ones, right? We don't, we're not studying the 95% of the things that don't work or 99% of the things that don't work. So there is this romantic notion that you jump in and then, you're a unicorn and then you're this and that and so on. Right? So I do think what you need hence is a very well prepared mind to say, I've got to go in and I'm going to, have the grit to hang in there, to be patient until the market comes to me or I get to a point where I become a sustainable business. It is not an easy journey. So to me, if we look at what we look for grit and determination. And part of why you will have it is you should have a whole lot of passion for the problem that you're solving, right?
Anisha, in many ways, GV did what Mohit also did in the previous episode, didn't he? I loved how he questioned the fundamental framework of comparison between Indian and Western startup ecosystems, and the ease with which he dismantled this way of thinking and then enumerated each of the factors underpinning the success or failure of Indian startups with their unique characteristics. There are such powerful insights to be unpacked from what GV said.
It's so true. We see so many professionals wanting to move out of the corporate world to become entrepreneurs, and the starting point is, I do not like what I'm doing. I don't want to be here. So if your starting point is not that you want to do something that you're passionate about, but it is something that you don't want to do and you're escaping something, and this seems like an easy option, you need to think hard.
Yeah, I think a startup first needs to be start right, not start wrong, right? Yeah. Well, what about you, Anisha? What STN hacks do you have for listeners this time around, and what insights and pointers can the Indian startup ecosystem use to storm this norm?
Well, I have 5 hacks as usual.
I'm all yours.
I think the journey of a startup from a possibility to a certainty is a tough one. Okay. You need to really persevere with a lot of passion to be able to see that through. And it's not just passion that gets you there. It is a lot of smarts and ingenuity. Okay. To make your idea move from a pie in the sky idea to a full blown boots on the ground business requires all kinds of smarts. Converting your idea to reality needs you to help others understand your vision. It's not just that you should understand your business idea. How do you convince others? Selling vision is much like selling change. Okay. And change is dynamic. There are so many moving parts all the time. You don't have anything finite and tangible in your hand when you're trying to convince people. Okay. So you have to first sell your idea. Clearly defining your value proposition and how it can generate revenue right from early upfront stages becomes very important. Selling lofty ideas without understanding how it will achieve financial results will never get you the right audience or the right buy-in.
So don't just have a value proposition, have a valuable business proposition.
Exactly.
Okay, what's the second one?
Many entrepreneurs develop strategies opportunistically without a frame of reference because they are starting from scratch. And when it comes to scaling up, they take a similar ad hoc approach to building their organization. They find formal structures and processes as bureaucratic threats to their entrepreneurial journey. They also worry about losing speed, control, and team intimacy. knowing when to transition from an informal organization to a well-governed structure with clearly defined roles is a key inflection point for startups to scale and transition to mature firms. And that means hiring professionals who could be better than you, empowering them. Okay. Be willing to relinquish control, defining processes and systems, putting a governance structure in place. All those are very critical, points that startups, once they achieve a minimum critical mass, need to make that journey and transition. Else they may end up paying a steep price, chaotic operations and unpredictable performance.
I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, madness is great to creating disruption, but you need method to scale and succeed. So you have to be disruptive, obviously, but you also have to be disciplined.
There is a method in the magic,
Yep.
Every founder yearns and aspires to make his or her startup a unicorn. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with having such an aspiration. But first and foremost, entrepreneurs need to focus on creating tangible value for the customer. And you know what? I have a hack within a hack here. One filter that you need to apply to your value proposition is your business creating new spends for the customer, or is it shifting spends? Let's not forget that the customer's wallet is finite. So if you are able to move him from shifting his spends from X to Y, and your proposition is strong enough to make him switch to you, that's when you know that you've created a valuable proposition. Valuation is just an outcome of creating a strong value proposition. The next one is the success of a startup is just an adjustment away. The market is volatile, the customer is dynamic, and the world at large is changing at an unprecedented pace. So why is your business static? Being adaptable and modular in your approach and knowing when to pivot is key to staying consistently relevant and thriving. The biggest mistake that we make is we get so wedded to our idea and we get so locked in that we start actually just so becoming inward focused and not paying attention to how the external world is changing, that you will see that the world has moved on, but your ideas remain there.
Yeah, I mean, it seems a little ironical. You started by disrupting. You're definitely not going to scale by being static.
I mean, so well said. Right. So well said.
And the other point that you said, right? We're not asking you to change constantly. We're asking you to be relevant constantly.
Be relevant constantly. Absolutely.
Okay.
And the last one, I think one can't just undermine the importance of this one enough. Startups live and die by their collaborations. As a small company with big dreams, startups need all the help they can get. Whether it's their own team working together as a tight-knit unit, relationship and support from VCs, leveraging personal and professional networks, collaborating with smart vendors, engaging and enabling consumers to help spread the word, or formal alliances with like-minded businesses. All of it is key to survival. Now and again, you will see that these relationships develop into bigger partnerships, and that end up having a major influence on the success of a startup.
So networking can make the difference between a startup not working or succeeding at scale.
Yes, prettily captured as usual, Naren.
And insightfully hacked as usual, Anisha. Okay, let me recap the 5 STN hacks once more for everyone. First, don't just have a value proposition, have a valuable business proposition. Second, be disruptive and disciplined. Third, always choose value creation over valuation creation. Fourth, be adaptive to change in order to thrive. And finally, don't just scale your ideas, scale your networks to succeed at scale. And if I'm offer a bonus in the context of the norm we stormed in the first place, don't bother about comparing yourself with global counterparts.
Well said.
All right, then. I think that's a good place to wrap up episode 14 of Storm the Norm. There are now multiple places you can catch us on Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud, and JioSaavn, all by just searching for Storm the Norm. And we're also on Saregama Karma 2.0 devices on channel 453. This is Narayan.
And Anisha.
Signing off for now. We'll be back with a new episode shortly. Thank you and talk to you soon.
Thank you.